Welcome to the Dark Souls section where I review every Soulsborne boss. Yes, every Soulsborne boss. I have a lot of bosses to cover, so let me quickly address one thing. If you want to hear my general thoughts on the boss design, there's a timestamp in the description that talks about Dark Souls 1 bosses as a whole. Now, let's talk about Dark Souls 1. Going back to the older games in this series is a real eye-opener. Asylum Demon does a good job at teaching players what Dark Souls is about, but you can really see the full picture of how FromSoft has upped their craft. He's not a mechanical boss like Margit or Dark Souls 3's tutorial boss. Instead, he rewards you for properly executing the plunge attack. FromSoft definitely sees a lot of potential in our boy, as they updated him and use him as the Erdtree avatar in Elden Ring. His legacy will truly never die since he's in their most popular game. Thank you, Miyazaki. Good boss. Even though Taurus Demon is a completely optional boss, he's probably what most players will do second, so that's what we're going to be doing on this playthrough. Something I simply don't understand with Dark Souls 1 is how FromSoftware nailed the concept of plunging attacks into the player with two separate bosses. The tutorial boss and now Taurus Demon heavily incentivizes the player to do a plunging attack to bite out a chunk of the boss's HP. FromSoftware didn't even try to make this a secret that only keen players will latch onto. You will hear and may even be pelted with arrows from above. And unless you didn't have your brain equipped when you were doing the tutorial, you were taught very obviously and succinctly to do a plunging attack. And it's really weird because after this boss, you don't really need to do a plunging attack on bosses ever again. I guess it's a good thing that this boss will be a pushover if you do the plunge attack because of how god-awful the boss arena is. Fighting him isn't anything special either. He dies pretty quickly and has limited moves. Since this boss will be most players' second boss they fight, I don't think it accomplishes much of anything. He is pretty easy, so he does at least give you some nice souls to level up. If there's one thing that the Bill Gargoyles should be remembered for, it's the fact that these two are the first good duo boss FromSoftware has made. Not only are they a great duo boss, but it did take some courage for FromSoftware to place these two as the get good boss in this game. Duo bosses are notoriously hard, and for every 10 duo bosses, only one turns out to be successful. These type of bosses are a lost art FromSoftware refuses to properly do, and when we do get around to Elden Ring, I hope that I properly shit on Godskin Duo. If anything, these two are the Man-Eater fight from Demon Souls done right. They both have a similar model, a terrible boss arena, but execute different styles for the player to master and properly maneuver through their attacks. The first gargoyle that you interact with is the melee guy, while the other gargoyle focuses on spitting fire. This exact concept is taken into the Ring City with our duo bats in there. Another lost art in FromSoftware's modern bosses is the idea of cutting off the boss tail for a reward. Players that started with a newer game and came to Dark Souls 1 later on without a guide may not even know that this mechanic exists and it's never explained to the player. That's another idea that we need to talk about, never explaining things to the player. The gameplay that you're seeing isn't a great example since I was on autopilot, sorry about that. But duo bosses usually turn into an easier challenge when you unlock your camera and fight them that way. Sekiro is the only game in this style that's close to being perfect with its camera, and when you do have a flawed camera, it would be a welcome lesson for FromSoft to teach the player how to use the camera in rare scenarios. I'm not a game design genius, so maybe there simply isn't a way besides making the player learn on their own. But since the camera is detached from the core gameplay experience, I think they would have at least attempted something by this point. The Gargoyles are definitely one of the harder bosses before Ornstein and Smough, and beating these two for the first time is probably a strenuous task for new Souls players. Moonlight Butterfly is a one-trick pony. The only thing that this boss has going for it is the fact that it looks pretty. And while I was painfully standing around waiting for her to land, I counted how many moves she has, and it's not many. She has a bomb she will cast when she is leaving her rest zone, a laser beam, an omnidirectional spread of rockets, and 3 focused bursts of magic. A boss with such a limited amount of moves to grab from is very unengaging to me, and she's just annoying to fight if you are melee. I could go on for longer, but I think you get the point by now. She feels like a filler boss that FromSoftware did not know how to make interesting, so they didn't, and neither will I. The Capra Demon is known for being a shit show of a boss for good reason. Pretty much everyone got bounced the first time they fought this guy, as he will jump attack you every time you enter his boss arena. He has a really weird gimmick where he has level enemies in his boss room that are 2 dogs. I don't really know what FromSoft was going for with this boss. He feels worse than your average catacomb boss in Elden Ring. And whether that is a compliment to Elden Ring or not, I'm going to leave that up for you to decide. Gaping Dragon is such a hideous and ugly boss that works in all the best ways. FromSoftware as a whole is not a jack of all trades. I truly believe that their best work resides in their level design and artistic talent. Their artistic talent created the Gaping Dragon to be a grotesque but interesting model to look at. That's one of the more interesting aspects with this fight, because if he was a gray character model with no style, he would be forgotten like my memory with most Demon Souls bosses at this point. One of the benefits with the older Souls games is the fact that they weren't so over the top that having big enemies like this does work if you know how to utilize your camera. Mistakes in games like Elden Ring are so punishing since that game's difficulty is pushed to the max. And when you fight an enemy in Elden Ring that has a poor camera with its high damage and the other oddities that FromSoft throws into the boss, it can quickly become a frustrating experience instead of an engaging experience. Fire Giant is the worst example of this, and going back to the older games feels like FromSoft were easily able to work around lesser aspects with their game. Gaping Dragon is not over the top, he's not complex, he is what he is. He doesn't always work super well with the camera, but whenever he doesn't, it's usually not that big of a deal since Dark Souls 1 allows you to stomach most attacks, and besides Sekiro, Dark Souls 1 feels like it's usually the most fair towards the player. He's also one of the few bosses in this game that rewards you for cutting off his tail. In some ways, I wish this idea was expanded on in From Software's newer games. Imagine boss souls not existing and you somehow had to earn the boss weapon within the fight itself. The fun idea with Quelaag is how she limits the player's arena space they're allowed to splash around in. Occasionally, Quelaag will spit lava on the ground, forcing you to focus on movements on your end alongside the boss. I always get a little hint of why I love duo bosses as much as I do, and Mohg from Elden Ring. Bosses with multiple targets, or Quelaag and Mohg, force you to understand your micro movements and some camera placement. You need to see where each target is and what level hazards stand in your way. Quelaag's boss arena doesn't take full advantage of this since her fight zone is so big that stepping around the lava pit isn't a strenuous task by any means. Mohg's arena in Elden Ring is a lot smaller, which forces you to master the level hazard, unlike this boss. This idea itself is what I find most interesting with this boss, as her moves are pretty limited with a few slashes, jumps, and a wide radius explosion. She isn't a bad boss by any means, but it's almost a nothing burger boss, a gimmick that you are not forced to master in a moveset that is uninteresting. C tier! Our lovely Iron Golem may look similar to Tower Knight as they are both extremely large, well, knights obviously, but they don't play that similarly. There's definitely some resemblance here though. From Software made 2 large knights where you focus on a leg and they will eventually topple over for some free damage. The most notable change with the Iron Golem fight is the boss arena and how little micro movements will go a long way since it's so easy to fall off. Gravity and Waterfowl is the #1 killer in Soulsborne games because he has a command grab with a terrible hitbox. I didn't even need to try and get this clip, his grab is so bad that he did it on my first try. You can see that I wasn't even close to where he was grabbing, but I was sucked into his grasp. I've died to him throwing me off the ledge more than a few times, similar to the Chained Ogre in Sekiro. He's not a great boss when you evaluate what he does, but that's most of Dark Souls 1 at this point. Most of the bosses in this game are definitely showing their age. I assume that pretty much everyone who is watching this video doesn't design games for a living, and when you lack the knowledge of what really goes into crafting art, such as games, you will naturally be ignorant to a lot of things. So, what I'm about to say may be my ignorance showing, but I would assume that making a duo boss is immeasurably harder than making a 1v1 boss. For every 10 duo bosses that are attempted, one of them turns out to be good. We can all name a slew of bad duo bosses, but just a handful of good duo bosses. I love this type of boss, and I can safely say that there's not many that are good, and Ornstein and Smough is one of them, but I would also say they are the worst good duo boss. But god damn, these two are still really fucking good. Something that From Software absolutely nailed is making these two feel like boss quality and not mini-boss quality. Other Souls-like games that I have played that attempt gank fights always make the enemies in the playing field feel like mini-boss quality enemies shoved into an arena with a boss health bar. I won't show footage to avoid spoilers, but Lysipe had an early to mid-game boss that feels exactly like what I just described. Enemies shoved into an arena that aren't bosses, rather I'd say they're mini-boss quality. And I don't even think it takes a lot to debate that. When we get to the second half and this boss turns into a 1v1, most of the boss's personality stays the same with a few added moves, although it's nothing radically different, which is good. If that is not enough, Ornstein is a literal boss in Dark Souls 2. He feels pretty bad in Dark Souls 2 because he feels close to the same, but he doesn't feel bad because he has a bad kit. It's just Dark Souls 2 being god awful, which is what it's best at. I tend to stay away from analyzing boss cutscenes, but I think the short and quick cutscenes work really well here. These two are fucking menacing, and the immediate close-up to Smough sets the mood as these two are not here to fuck around. These two are one of the more unique gank fights From Software has ever made because they are the closest to a true melee fight that's great. Other good melee gank fights such as the Ring City bats in Sister Phase 2 really change how the enemy AI works when you are fighting them. The ringed city has one of the bats go into more of a ranged mode, spitting fire at you while you mainly focus on the melee bat in front of you. There will be the occasional moment where both of them are simultaneously attacking you, but waiting it out for a few seconds will turn the tides back into your favor while the other goes into that ranged mode. And on Sister Phase 2, FromSoft really toned down Frida's AI. She will even attempt to heal Father Ariandel and plays a lot more passively. But Ornstein and Smough, these two, they are both melee, and I would assume From Software had a harder time making sure their kits flow together like they do. And how From Software solved this and made it work is really genius. One of them is fast, one of them is slow. There will be the occasional bits of downtime where their attacks do overlap with each other, but I find that this is one of the few bosses that From Software has ever made where playing reactively instead of proactively is better for me and more enjoyable. During Phase 2, I usually enjoy engaging with Smough's beefy attacks more. If you cannot tell by my build, I always gravitate towards large, strong characters in fiction. Not only do I enjoy fighting Phase 2 Smough more than Ornstein, but goddamn he's a fucking beast. Look at how he doesn't give a fuck and smashes Ornstein's near lifeless body. What FromSoft did is so unexpected, and if I am being honest, I forgot how this cutscene played out and I was shocked at how cool it was. Smough is the better of the two, all's I'm saying. It's funny how Ornstein seems to show a little bit of respect towards Smough's body when he's up for Phase 2. Some really good visual storytelling From Software did with this boss. When I was replaying this game for this video, I kept playing with the idea in my head, what if From Software remade this game? Because if there was one Souls game that I think could use a remake, it would be this game. FromSoft has plenty of great ideas shoved into this game, more so on the level and world design, but since From Software has perfected their Souls combat and gotten a lot better at making games, I wonder how or what they would change with these two. I want to be clear, it was just a thought. I would rather From Software tackle new art pieces instead of a remake. This idea just popped into my head and I thought it was fun to think about. Stray Demon is a reuse of the Asylum Demon with a few added moves From Software added onto his kit. I think it's more of a fun callback for players that were keen on coming back to the tutorial area. You can even see this guy flopping his fat ass around when you are in the tutorial. I think this reuse is justified if From Software really just wanted you to remember that there might be unfinished business at the Undead Asylum. Oh. Sif uses ludonarrative in the boss fight better than the actual mechanics of the fight itself. I definitely don't catch every single time From Software does proper ludonarrative in their games, but the strongest example I can think of is holding R1 versus Owl in Sekiro. We've all heard someone talk about how Sif uses Artorias' sword to fight, or how Sif will limp near the end of the fight. That's all great stuff, and most games that I play do a poor job at using the medium of video games as a way to tell a gripping story. The mechanics of this fight are pretty forgettable, as FromSoft most likely wanted this to be the front and center. It's not something that I always latch onto, but I really respect the idea and I hope it doesn't go away. Oh god damn it, FromSoft, this isn't even the worst boss in Dark Souls 1, but Seath is fucking awful. When I was fighting Seath for this playthrough, I was getting flashbacks to Judicator in Demon Souls. I don't think he even touched me when I killed him, and Seath only damaged me once with his crystal spit. The latter half of Dark Souls 1's bosses are really bad. The next one is so bad that it's just kind of sad. Why hello there, Pinwheeeeel. Once again, you're being laughed at. Ha ha ha! Pinwheeeeel has devolved into a meme within the Souls community for good reason. His health pool is so minuscule that it's hard to even see what mechanics he has. Since he can be the very first boss that you fight after the tutorial, his HP was probably balanced around that fact. So I am going to say an objective, undeniable fact. Pinwheeeeel is the best boss in the game. I've never fought him as the first boss, but since he can be the first boss after our tutorial, and he has mechanics, he's the best. Pinwheeeeel is our savior, and he will go down as one of the best bosses From Software has ever made. He's the best boss ever, S tier. Gravelord Nito is a semi-complicated boss for his time. Not only is he one of the coolest looking in the game, but he also has ads in his boss room you are forced to look after. With a circular boss arena, my very first kill on Nito was me running in circles stabbing his skeleton ass for victory. But my brain has devolved into a filthy strength player. So he went down almost as fast as Pinwheeeeel on this kill. Womp womp. Oh god, no. We're in the worst fucking area of Dark Souls 1, and this boss sucks. He doesn't do much of anything besides slamming his fat arm down and breathing fire at the player. That's it, really. He's without a doubt one of the easiest and worst bosses in Dark Souls 1. I couldn't tell you what was added by making him a boss, or this whole level while we're at it. This part of the game is some of FromSoft's worst work, and by god, it has not aged well. Another goddamn reskin? Well, this is the perfect time to play fair. Elden Ring isn't the only Souls game with bad reuse. I mean, it is the Souls game with the most annoying reuse, but almost all of FromSoft's games have some reuse. Sekiro has it, Dark Souls 1 has it, they exist, and it's all there. At least Elden Ring recycles a bunch of good enemies that we just get tired of seeing. I don't think the dragon moveset that's spammed in that game is boring to fight, but after a few times, I just don't want to do it anymore. I also don't know what is going through From Software's head with the tutorial boss of Dark Souls. He's used in Elden Ring and 3 times in Dark Souls. From Software also likes reusing their first boss with a fire twist from time to time. I mean, have you seen Lawrence in Bloodborne? Centipede Demon feels worse than your average Demon Souls boss. He has a less interesting kit to interact with, and his whole boss arena is covered with an orange hue, making for an extremely ugly and aesthetically displeasing arena. I don't even think he looks cool in a weird way such as Mateer from Elden Ring. Instead, it just looks stupid and nothing more. Oh god, why From Software? Why? This is awful. I can't even make a joke about this fight being good since my audience voted for Artorias as the best fight in Dark Souls. I wanted to try and make this boss sound like it's not fucking miserable, but I can't even do that. Bed of Chaos has a reputation for being the worst boss in the entire series. Everything about the design of this boss is broken at its core. It even makes Dark Souls break its own rules when you die. Dying here doesn't reset your progress, as the shields on the side of the boss arena stay dead, meaning you just have to play the trial and error game and hope you don't get knocked off by his bullshit attacks. And don't get me started on this fucking run back here. It's bad. My condolences to anyone who didn't know about the illusionary wall to make it less cancer. The runback will be brutal if you do it the long way. Some bosses I think are bad, such as Millennia, but at least she forces me to use my brain. Bed of Chaos feels like I'm praying to Miyazaki himself, begging that I don't fucking die. It's miserable. Just goddamn fucking miserable. Four Kings is one of the last base game fights that I do when I play Dark Souls, so I think I'm usually overleveled for their encounter. I've never seen them do more than just a few of their moves when I fight them. The best part about their boss fight is the atmosphere in the black boss room, making it really feel like you're not welcome here. Maybe I am just playing Dark Souls 1 wrong, but these guys seem like they could use a bit more HP. I don't look up guides for these type of games unless it's necessary, and when I was doing my first Dark Souls 1 playthrough 6 years ago, I had to look up a guide on where to find these guys. They were the last boss I had to do, and I slaughtered them then, and I slaughter them now. Priscilla is the last Nothing Burger boss in Dark Souls 1. I tried to not say the word Nothing Burger that much in this video, but Dark Souls 1 is a lot of those bosses. Bosses that are uninteresting to me and don't offer any value. Some of them are acceptable, and Priscilla is one of them, but the bad bosses I just mentioned are usually in the latter half of the game. The reason why I think Priscilla is fine, even if she isn't a great boss, is because the Painted World level just feels like an extra add-on to Dark Souls. I don't think this game needed the Painted World to justify its $60 launch price tag. So when I look at it that way, the Painted World is almost like a free DLC, so I don't have many positive things to say about her. What I do want to say is that I wonder how FromSoft balances their bosses. Morgott in Elden Ring is commonly criticized for having a great moveset, but needed an HP buff to really appreciate what he does. Every time I fight Morgott, I accidentally steamroll his ass with no pushback. But From Software will approve other fights with questionable moves or other issues. I just don't get it. Prisciller, what the fuck? Well, now I'm keeping that in. Priscilla suffers the same fate that Morgott did, as you can't really appreciate what she does since her HP is laughably low. Dark Sun Gwyndolin is yet another boss with really low health, although it works a lot better than Priscilla and Pinwheeeeel. He's not much of a mechanical boss that forces you to master the mechanics. The enjoyment of this boss really comes down to the gimmick of duck and cover. Dodge his spells, continue progressing forward. Again, Dark Souls 1 can be a weird game, and his HP is really low, and he died in 4 hits from my big ass weapon. But I don't feel like his low HP was a detriment to the fight like it can be with some of the others in this game. And hey, he's more of a lore boss anyway. He even reuses Moonlight Butterfly's music. Kinda forgettable, but it's a boss of its time. We're getting really close to the end of Dark Souls, and this game ends on a definite high note. From Software makes some of the best DLCs in the industry, and Artorias of the Abyss is no different. The first boss that's in this DLC is a real step up from the average boss fight in the base game. I wouldn't say Sanctuary Guardian is better than my favorite base game boss, Ornstein and Smough, but he's definitely a step up. And he really shows how From Software treats their products as art, and not just a financial machine to garner as much money as possible. Sanctuary Guardian does high damage, he's hard for a Dark Souls 1 boss, and he's a lot more aggressive than what we're used to within the base game, forcing you to stay aware of the boss itself. The only real issue I have with this boss is that I think every chimera in fiction looks fucking stupid. I see them as ugly amalgamations of other fictional creatures. Some may say that's the point, I still think it just looks kind of lame to me, but it has a great moveset. It's about time we get around to our boy, because I freaking love Artorias. We all know that he's the best fight in this game, and he still holds up in every way possible. It's clear that FromSoft wanted Artorias to be a memorable experience, and they demanded him to be the best of the best. Fighting him does not feel like I'm fighting a boss in Dark Souls 1, because he has the presentation and moveset complexity of a Dark Souls 3 boss. He's freaking awesome. I love him. Artorias really pushed the needle of From Software's overall boss design, and I think they really learned a lot with what he does, and further iterated upon what is possible in Bloodborne's DLC and Dark Souls 3 as a whole. Maybe my opinion will change when we get to Gale, but I feel like Gale is the perfected version of Artorias, and fighting Artorias is just as awesome. He's the only boss in the Souls combat that somehow reminded me of Bloodborne when I was fighting him. It reminded me the most of Orphan of Kos, and it was two beefy people trading blows back and forth. I really loved that idea when I fight Artorias. I find it more engaging to take his blows head on and trade with him, and that's not something that I care to do. I like to dodge and punish, but Artorias has this special aura that demands respect. He's really, really good, and my audience voted him as the best boss in Dark Souls 1. You can even knock him out of his phase transition if you want, but I am an honorable duelist, and I will allow him to become more powerful. Holy mother of God, Manus is one of the hardest bosses in Dark Souls 1. It's either him or Ornstein and Smough. If you can manage your camera with Anne Orlando's tag team duo, you'll find them slightly easier. But Manus may take the cake because this dude makes us look like we're playing in slow motion. He's without a doubt the fastest enemy in this game, and he is the fastest Dark Souls 1 can handle. He's not just a one-trick pony, because this dude hits like a truck. Luckily, I have a huge brain and find some of the tankiest shit in the game since I don't have the talent to dodge this dude's wombo combo. The only real downside I see to Manus is the silver pendant that you can use in his boss fight. I apologize that I didn't get great footage to showcase this, but you can use this item in his boss fight to remove some of his incoming spells that he throws at you. Things like this with Manus or the item in Malekith's fight are items that I don't like having in the game. If you don't use these items or know that they exist, it can start to feel like you're simply not understanding the fight, but it's a lack of a niche item that you're using. Sekiro handled this perfectly since prosthetic tools in that game are taught to the player early on, and all of them have a rare niche time to use them. But I will not let that take anything away from Manus. He's not as good as Artorias, duh, but he's still really, really good. Kalameet is similar to Madeira, and I think most players will fight him last since he is a completely optional boss. It's not super obvious on how you're supposed to fight him, as you have to die to him once, talk to an NPC, and then you can fight him. Even with the tedious prerequisite steps you have to do, he's well worth the encounter. He was the first good dragon boss From Software had ever made in their Souls games. It did take a little while for him to be dethroned, but it did eventually happen with Dark Souls 3. Kalameet also just looks way cooler than every other dragon. His breath attacks are what I enjoy the most with his aesthetic. It must have been a real strenuous task for From Software to pull off a good dragon fight. I mean, we all saw Dragon God in Demon Souls. That was fucking awful. And I think it's a strong achievement Dark Souls 1 has because we can all say Dark Souls 1 started the trend of cool dragon bosses. Gwyn is not the type of final boss that forces you to master every mechanic such as Sekiro. He's quite the opposite actually. If you've made it this far, you're going to enjoy every other aspect about his fight besides the mechanics. Unless you simply hate music, you're going to love his OST as it is fucking awesome. While I'm working on other videos, I tend to have background music going to keep my brain active, and this soundtrack is one of them. I love Gwyn's music and I love Dark Souls 1. There's definitely some nostalgia here, I won't deny it. I played Dark Souls 1 all the way back in 2019 and I didn't fall in love with the games until 2020. But my first playthrough of Dark Souls 1 almost sparked the flame that I have for the game nowadays, and I think a part of that nostalgia I just mentioned is his music. I think it's just epic. I believe that Gwyn is a weak mechanical boss, but I also feel like it's more for story purposes. He is not a menacing boss, and he doesn't have a demanding stature such as Ludwig. From Software usually likes to make bosses larger than the player, and I can only assume it's to make the player feel weak in their desolate and somber worlds. Gwyn is close to the exact same size as the player, and with his fight being easy, maybe FromSoft was trying to make you feel bad for him. I really do wish I gave a damn about From Software and Miyazaki's storytelling, as I know that it's strong, it's just something that I was never able to click with. And I have always had this dim light inside of me that thinks Dark Souls 1 has the strongest story. I just don't know why. But what I do know is that Dark Souls 1 is still to this day freaking awesome. And that's Gwyn. So let's talk about Dark Souls 1 bosses as a whole and how they hold up. Oddly enough, I would say Dark Souls 1 has the closest boss similarities to Elden Ring. That statement itself is pretty odd, and I didn't even expect it when I was typing it out. Let's look at Dark Souls 3 real quick to clear the air. Now, I just want to state Dark Souls 3 does not have perfect bosses, and my opinion may change as I have not played a complete playthrough of Dark Souls 3 in a little over 2 years. But Dark Souls 3's base game bosses are all decent enough. I think each boss has something to make it at least memorable, but memorable in a good way. Falling down the boss arena versus Great Curse Rotwood, or the jump scare with High Lord Walnir. And I did in fact pick some of the weaker boss fights in that game because these fights had something that made me remember them. Where Dark Souls and Elden Ring come into play is that both of these games have a lot of shitty and uninteresting bosses, boring bosses even. Most of Elden Ring's Remembrance bosses are great, I like them, but there's a lot of bosses that aren't Remembrance bosses in that game that are just annoying, and I don't enjoy fighting them. But the highs of Elden Ring's bosses are, of course, very high, and that's exactly like Dark Souls 1, at least it is for me. Ornstein and Smough, Artorias, and Manus still hold up really well. And yes, I only have 3, but Dark Souls 1 is ancient. And with the 3 excellent bosses in this game with a handful of good, not great we have a lot of shitty ones. Flat out bad bosses. Luckily, Dark Souls is an easy game if you're experienced with Souls games. If you can beat Elden Ring, no. In fact, if you can beat Elden Ring with a summon, that is still harder than 90% of Dark Souls bosses. Yeah, Elden Ring is that hard of a game. In fact, I'd probably say it's From Software's hardest game at this point. So yeah, that's Dark Souls 1. I think it's an excellent game, an ancient masterpiece, and I cannot fairly judge them from a 2011 perspective. But if I can praise the few that I adore to this day, then I have a feeling that the mid-tier bosses in this game were great back in the day. So Dark Souls bosses hold up in their own way, and Dark Souls 1 is not a boss game for me. Dark Souls 3 is a boss game. Sekiro is a boss game. Dark Souls 1 is a journey game, but the bosses can also be a part of that journey. They're just not the highlight of that journey like the level design is.